A thunderclap shook the windowpane as water streamed from the sky like an open faucet, and just as I checked that my rain barrels were filling up beautifully, I received a violation notice from the HOA saying they were visually offensive to the neighborhood's natural aesthetic. I stared at the letter, then back at my barrels, which were tucked neatly behind a privacy fence, completely invisible unless someone went out of their way to peek. Someone like Karen Cartwright, the HOA president, who once fined a man for having wind chimes that were too musical. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or install another barrel out of spite. It all started innocently enough. I had always been the type to mind my business. My wife and I had moved into Willow Ridge for the peace and quiet, tree-lined streets, calm neighbors, and proximity to my job as a civil engineer. But behind the neatly trimmed hedges and cozy porches lurked a board of clipboard-wielding suburban overlords, hell-bent on ensuring no lawn strayed from conformity. And at the helm was Karen, the queen of compliance and self-appointed savior of suburban aesthetics. After a particularly dry season, I decided to install a few rain barrels to collect stormwater for my vegetable garden. It was eco-friendly, legal, and frankly, pretty smart given how often our neighborhood flooded during heavy rain. I chose discreet, forest green barrels, tucked them behind my garage, and even installed a small trellis with ivy to blend them into the landscape. To anyone but an aerial drone or a nosy neighbor armed with a ladder, they were invisible. But Karen always had a knack for finding problems where none existed. The letter arrived the morning after a heavy storm, when most people were dealing with minor backyard flooding. I was in a good mood. My barrels had prevented an entire section of my garden from turning into a swamp. Then I saw the envelope, sealed with the HOA's smug logo, a stylized house wrapped in barbed red tape. The letter accused me of installing non-approved water storage structures in visible areas, citing HOA Code 14.3.1 subsection G, which I later found out literally had no mention of rain barrels at all. I called Karen to clarify. She answered on the third ring with that sugary sweet voice that always made my skin crawl. After I explained my confusion, she responded, "Ray, even if the city allows it, the HOA has a higher standard of beauty. Your barrels don't match the community's visual harmony. You have 10 days to remove them." Click. I stood there, phone still to my ear, trying to process what I had just heard. Visual harmony? These were containers that saved water. Water that otherwise would be pouring into the already stressed storm drains and turning the clubhouse lawn into a marsh. And now I was being fined because my efforts to be responsible didn't pass Karen's imaginary style test? I tried reasoning with the HOA. I sent in a formal appeal with photos showing the barrels were hidden, with added references to local environmental incentives and rebate programs. I even included a brief engineering diagram to illustrate how my setup actually reduced stormwater overflow, a major problem in our area. But my appeal was flatly denied within 48 hours. Karen had the final word, and apparently that word was remove. Frustrated, I started digging deeper. And that's when I learned something interesting. The clubhouse, Karen's precious baby, used for wine tastings, board meetings, and her husband's poker nights, had an outdated drainage system. It sat at the lowest elevation in the entire neighborhood. The only reason it didn't flood every time it rained was because homeowners like me managed our water. But if someone, say, stopped doing that, or worse, gently encouraged runoff to find a new route, well, the clubhouse might just learn a soggy lesson about what real water mismanagement looked like. The idea was crazy, petty, potentially brilliant. I talked it over with Lucas, my old friend from college and now a stormwater consultant. He laughed so hard I thought he might choke on his coffee. "Dude," he said between gasps, "you could literally reroute a river if you wanted to. Why not a little stormwater?" That's when it clicked. Not only could I legally redirect water on my own property, I could also revive an old irrigation channel that, once upon a time, used to supply the now-defunct community garden behind the clubhouse. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about proving a point. Karen's obsession with cosmetic perfection was undermining genuine environmental efforts. She'd rather have concrete statues of geese and identical mailbox flags than let someone collect water in their backyard. If I couldn't win with logic, maybe I could win with irony. Sweet, damp, delicious irony. I started planning. Not hastily or recklessly. I was an engineer, after all. I reviewed the HOA bylaws line by line, city plumbing codes, property boundary documents, even historical landscaping map. Everything had to be above board, or at least buried deep enough not to raise eyebrows. I wasn't going to damage anything. Just let nature flow the way it wanted to. In the meantime, Karen ramped up her campaign of pettiness. She sent compliance officers to patrol the neighborhood, volunteers in reflective vests who spent their mornings measuring grass blade heights and photographing recycling bins. One of them, a guy named Earl with the social skills of a stump, tried to lean over my fence to snap another picture of the barrels. My motion-triggered sprinkler caught him square in the face. The photo ended up on the neighborhood Facebook group with the caption, "Earl goes swimming." It got 128 likes in under an hour. Even as the pressure mounted, I played nice. I removed one visible barrel and replaced it with a dummy trellis, just to throw them off. Meanwhile, I installed what I started calling my passive-aggressive plumbing network. Nothing mechanical, just gravity-fed lines, camouflaged outlets, and a few smart drainage redirections. All invisible. All ready. The skies darkened again 1 week later. Another storm rolled in, and this one wasn't holding back. Thunder shook rooftops, water poured down the streets like a silver tide, and in the midst of it, the HOA clubhouse lights flickered once, twice, and then went out. The basement sump pump, overwhelmed, gave up with a wheeze. Water found its way through the vents, under the doors, and into the carpeted floor where Karen had just hosted a fundraising dinner. And me? I stood on my porch, dry as a bone, sipping coffee from my mug labeled Certified Drain Wizard, watching the rainwater do exactly what nature, and a little creative rerouting, intended. The morning after the flood was pure comedy, if you had the stomach for dark humor and damp carpets. I took a walk past the HOA clubhouse under the guise of checking my mailbox, and what I saw nearly made me spit out my coffee. Karen stood outside with her arms flailing like a windmill in distress, barking orders at two poor maintenance workers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The clubhouse doors were propped open, box fans whirring at full blast, and a faint smell of mildew already hung in the air. A growing water stain ran along the sidewalk, like nature itself was signing its name on her precious kingdom. I didn't stop. I didn't wave. I didn't even smirk, at least not until I was halfway down the block. What I did do was begin Phase 2. Operation Rainstorm had only just begun. What had happened the night before wasn't even the full capacity of what I'd set up. It was just the preliminary test, an unassuming trial to prove to myself it worked. And it had. Oh, how it had. The rerouted water from my upgraded drainage system flowed smoothly, silently, and precisely. It didn't damage anything. It simply went where it was now welcome. I returned home to find Lucas already waiting on my porch, holding a box of donuts like it was a trophy. He raised it up like Simba in The Lion King and said, "To the Storm King goes the spoils." We sat down, munching sugary pastries while reviewing the video footage. My cameras had caught everything from Earl's second failed attempt at a covert inspection to the exact timestamp when the clubhouse lights blinked and went out. There was no physical evidence of tampering, no pipes crossing legal boundaries, no pumps or mechanical devices. Just nature, gravity, and the quiet genius of someone who reads too many civil infrastructure manuals for fun. By the afternoon, the HOA had sent out an email titled, "Unfortunate Water Intrusion Incident," where they vaguely blamed unforeseen infrastructural weaknesses exacerbated by unusual rainfall. I almost laughed out loud. If they considered last night's storm unusual, they had no idea what was coming. According to the forecast, we were in for a full week of steady rain. Not hurricanes, not tornadoes. Just good, solid, steady water from the skies. Perfect conditions for my system to work like clockwork. But it wasn't enough just to sit back and let the rain do its thing. No, I had to stay 3 steps ahead. Karen was too nosy to let this go without hunting for a scapegoat. So I made it easy for her to keep looking in the wrong direction. I placed 2 large potted plants near my side fence, concealing the subtle end points of my drainage system. I added fake downspouts that appeared to flow back into my lawn instead of toward the old irrigation line. I even laid out some deliberately chaotic yardwork debris to make it seem like I was just a disorganized homeowner struggling with runoff. Karen, of course, couldn't resist. 2 days later, another letter arrived, this time citing continued suspicion of non-compliant drainage activity. That wasn't even a real violation, but it didn't stop her from trying. She demanded access to inspect my property. I responded with a simple printed note attached to my gate. No access without legal warrant or emergency cause. HOA is not law enforcement. I knew the rules. She didn't have a leg to stand on. She'd have to either break the law or give up. She chose the third option, escalation. Suddenly, the HOA was patrolling more often. Earl came by 3 days in a row. I added motion-activated floodlights and a speaker that played a barking dog sound whenever someone approached the fence. My yard became the most well-guarded strip of grass in the entire subdivision. Meanwhile, the pipes under the soil did their job quietly. Another rain hit. This time, I increased the flow. Not drastically, just enough to ensure the clubhouse's already soggy carpets wouldn't stand a chance at drying out. The next morning, I saw a plumber's van parked outside the clubhouse. Karen stood next to it, clipboard in hand, giving a statement to what looked like another HOA board member. I watched as they argued. The board member pointed toward my property more than once, clearly trying to play detective. But the real smoking gun was buried 2 feet underground and shielded by a flower bed filled with strategically placed stepping stones. That night, Lucas and I celebrated with pizza and a blueprint review. He was now fully invested. What started as a joke had become a civil engineering experiment for him. We optimized the angles, recalculated the flow rates, and discussed whether we should add a slow-release valve for more surgical application during lighter storms. I laughed, telling him he sounded like we were building a tactical irrigation weapon. He didn't disagree. We weren't the only ones enjoying the spectacle. Neighborhood gossip was reaching critical mass. People were starting to notice the coincidence between my bone-dry backyard and the perpetual state of dampness engulfing the HOA's beloved clubhouse. Rumors spread that I was some kind of rain wizard. One neighbor asked if I had some special weatherproofing spray. Another asked where I got my soil. Karen must have heard all of it because she doubled down on her effort. She sent out an HOA-wide bulletin reminding residents that tampering with water flow or using unauthorized landscaping that affects runoff direction is grounds for board action. It was like watching a queen scold her subjects after realizing the peasants were enjoying the mudslide more than her royal decrees. Karen's biggest problem was that she still didn't know what I had done, and that drove her mad. She knew something had changed. She could feel the balance of suburban power slipping, but every time she tried to catch me in the act, all she saw was a guy watering his tomato plants and sipping lemonade. She couldn't report what she couldn't prove. And the moment she got too aggressive, she'd step over a legal line. It was at that point I realized I wasn't just winning, I was reshaping the battlefield. This wasn't about flooding a clubhouse anymore. It was about exposing the ridiculous, self-righteous fragility of an HOA that cared more about appearances than community. And the best part? I was doing it with water. The one thing no HOA can fully control, regulate, or predict. The coming weekend promised a thunderstorm that would put the last one to shame. The clouds were forming, and I could already feel the pressure drop. My system was ready. The infiltration pipes had been tested, the outlets checked, and my cameras angled just right. If the HOA thought last week was bad, They were about to learn what happened when you declared war on rain barrels and picked a fight with a man who designs flood control systems for a living. By the time the third storm hit, the clubhouse wasn't just damp, it was downright unusable. I knew because I happened to stroll by during one of their emergency HOA meetings, which they had relocated to a neighbor's garage after the smell of mildew became impossible to ignore. The clubhouse carpet had been pulled up, industrial fans whirred 24/7, and a large dumpster sat in the parking lot filled with ruined chairs, soggy drywall, and what looked like several binders of HOA documentation that probably hadn't been touched since 2009. I had to bite my tongue to avoid grinning. The stormwater system I'd quietly reactivated was functioning flawlessly. The runoff from my roof, patio, and garden was no longer seeping harmlessly into my soil. It was moving with purpose, redirected through buried channels straight toward the lowest elevation point in the entire neighborhood, the HOA's precious social hub. It was incredible how easily chaos could take root in a system obsessed with control. Karen, despite her iron grip over the board, was clearly struggling to maintain her composure. I watched from a distance as she paced back and forth, her arms flapping in frustration as another member of the board waved a moisture sensor around like a divining rod. They were desperate to find a culprit, but their theories kept bouncing between bad luck, faulty construction, and some vague conspiracy involving raccoons nesting in the gutters. I could have told them exactly what was wrong: the land, the slope, the clogged drains, but I didn't want to spoil the mystery just yet. That night, I received an anonymous note in my mailbox. No return address, just a typed message that read, "Whatever you're doing, it's working. Don't stop. A grateful neighbor." That gave me an idea. I wasn't the only one annoyed by the HOA's petty rule enforcement. If I could keep the pressure on, maybe it would push others to speak up, too. The HOA had thrived on apathy and silence. It was time for a little community inspiration. I quietly began talking to neighbors. Nothing too obvious, just light conversations during walks or while working in the yard. I asked about their experiences with the HOA, if they'd ever been fined, hassled, or ignored. The stories poured out. One family had been written up for letting their kids draw chalk art on the sidewalk. Another got a warning for putting up holiday lights 2 days early. People weren't just annoyed, they were tired. And now, with the clubhouse turned into a fungal terrarium, their patience was wearing thin. Karen, meanwhile, doubled down. She tried to ban outdoor work during storms, citing potential hazards and risk of altering drainage paths. It was absurd and unenforceable. She installed a temporary camera facing my property from the clubhouse, mounted on a rusted pole with duct tape. It looked like a scarecrow someone had built using security parts from a 90s electronics store. I responded by planting a large sunflower directly in front of the lens. It grew fast. A week later, the board called an official community forum, hoping to win back support. The email invitation said it would be held at the clubhouse, but in a twist that almost made me feel bad, the carpet crew had just discovered mold in the subfloor. So the meeting got moved again, to a local elementary school cafeteria. The irony was thick. An HOA obsessed with appearances now had to beg for free space like a washed-up community theater group. I attended the meeting out of sheer curiosity. The turnout was surprisingly high. Dozens of residents packed the room, some clearly annoyed, others just curious. Karen stood at the front with her usual over-rehearsed smile, flanked by the board, most of whom looked like they would rather be anywhere else. She opened with a long-winded speech about unity, standards, and resilience in the face of environmental unpredictability. But when she tried to pivot to her real agenda, new proposals to restrict personal drainage systems, increase surveillance funding, and implement stricter fines, people started shifting in their chairs. Then something happened I didn't expect. A woman from the back stood up and interrupted Karen mid-sentence. Her name was Valerie, a retired teacher who had lived in the neighborhood since it was built. She calmly asked why the HOA was focusing on punishing residents instead of fixing its own infrastructure. Karen tried to talk over her, but Valerie didn't back down. She listed a series of ignored maintenance requests, drainage complaints, and half-hearted patch jobs that the board had dismissed over the years. By the time she finished, a wave of murmurs had swept through the room. More people stood up. A man named Theo spoke about being fined for repainting his porch step. Another couple shared how Karen had denied them a request to build a wheelchair ramp for their visiting grandmother. The room was turning. Karen tried to regain control by insisting that unity required sacrifice and standards, but it only made things worse. A young dad from the corner called out, "Is unity why you sent 3 letters about my sandbox?" Laughter broke out. Karen's face twitched. I stayed silent, just watching, soaking it in. My plan had worked better than I imagined. Not just the water diversion, but the pressure. People had finally started seeing the HOA's tyranny for what it was. Not order, not pride, just pettiness wrapped in rules. The next day, I got another note in the mailbox. This one wasn't anonymous. It was signed by 3 neighbors and asked if I would be willing to join the HOA board during the next election. I nearly spit out my coffee again. Me? The guy with the rain barrels? The guy who had quietly turned the clubhouse into an indoor swamp? I laughed for a full minute before I realized they were serious. But I wasn't finished yet. Karen wasn't going to step down easily. Her pride was cemented into the very foundations of the HOA. And she wasn't giving up without a fight. That's why I needed one more storm. One more perfect downpour to show everyone, without a shred of doubt, where the real drainage problem was, and who had tried to cover it up with fines and flyers. I checked the weather. A full weekend of rain was coming. The soil was already saturated, the club's drainage system still crippled. I made a few final adjustments to my system, small tweaks to increase flow, better spread the water load, and make sure nothing redirected back toward my yard. Then I waited. Friday night, it began. A slow drizzle, then a steady soak, then hours of heavy rain. I sat on my porch, sipping tea, watching the gutters overflow in perfect symmetry with my rerouted channels. It was poetry in motion. Down the street, lights in the clubhouse flickered again. Another blackout. This time, I didn't need to see the inside to know what was happening. The ground had spoken. Nature had cast its vote. And Karen? She would soon find out that her war on rain barrels had awakened something far more powerful than she ever expected. You said. Saturday morning arrived with a dense fog hanging low over the neighborhood, like nature itself was savoring the aftermath of the night's storm. I pulled on a rain jacket and headed down the sidewalk, not out of curiosity, but for a routine I'd developed, taking a slow walk after every storm just to gauge the visible effect. It had become a ritual, one that kept me calm, focused, and, let's be honest, immensely entertained. As I turned the corner and caught sight of the HOA clubhouse, it was immediately clear that last night had delivered exactly what I hoped for. The entire front entrance was cordoned off with caution tape. 2 industrial vacuum units sat humming in the parking lot, and a thick, grimy stream of water trailed from the side utility door. A maintenance worker stood by the door holding a soaked panel of drywall that bent in the middle like wet cardboard. Karen wasn't there. That surprised me. Normally she would have been front and center, giving orders or delivering dramatic sighs to passing residents. Her absence was almost eerie, like the queen of the HOA hive had finally realized she was losing control of the swarm. I wasn't the only one watching. A few other neighbors had emerged, quietly observing the scene from their porches or pretending to jog while clearly gawking. One woman walked her dog by 4 times within 15 minutes. The clubhouse, once a symbol of community control, was now the neighborhood's most dysfunctional attraction. But the real storm hit Monday morning. Karen, clearly fed up and seeking revenge in the only way she knew how, filed a formal cease and desist letter against me through the HOA's legal counsel. The document accused me of malicious water redirection, property sabotage, and acts of environmental warfare. That last phrase nearly made me choke on my toast. I read it twice to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. She'd actually called it warfare. She even demanded an emergency meeting with the board to pursue a motion for fines, legal injunction, and possible removal of my voting rights in the association. It was an escalation, and not a small one. Lucas came over as soon as he heard. He tossed the letter onto my kitchen table and said, "She's panicking. You've got her." I nodded, already pulling out the binders I had prepped weeks ago. I'd anticipated this. Every inch of my system had been documented. Every change I made, every rerouted gutter, every runoff path, every property line. It was all recorded, mapped, and double-checked against municipal code. I had legal precedent on my side. I even had a signed statement from the city engineer confirming my upgrades were not only within regulation, but environmentally beneficial. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at a rented library hall. Karen's carefully cultivated empire was too moldy for gatherings now, which made her dramatic entrance even more absurd. She walked in holding a folder thick with printed photos and what looked like hand-drawn maps of my property. I arrived quietly, greeted a few neighbors, and took a seat near the middle of the room. The tension in the air was sharp. Everyone could feel that something big was about to break. Karen opened with a long monologue, full of flowery language about community values, shared spaces, and the threat posed by rogue behavior. She painted me as a saboteur, a man with a vendetta who had undermined the structural sanctity of the neighborhood with underground water channels and illegal infrastructure. I kept my face blank as she passed around her folder, which included blurry photos of puddles, screenshots from the HOA surveillance camera, and a poorly drawn diagram labeled Suspicious Flow Paths. When she finished, the board turned to me. I stood, calmly, and placed my binder on the table. Then I opened it and spoke clearly. I started with the law. I cited the specific municipal codes that allowed rainwater collection and redirection on private property. I referenced the city's own flood mitigation guidelines, which encouraged passive diversion systems and even offered rebates for such installations. I handed over the signed affidavit from the Environmental Board. Then, I displayed high-resolution photos of my system, marked property lines, and drainage angles. Everything was neat, legal, and undeniable. Then I dropped the final piece. A series of timestamps and satellite overlay images showing how, for the past 3 years, the clubhouse had experienced mild but increasing flooding, well before I ever installed a single barrel. The problem wasn't me. It was the HOA's neglected infrastructure. Karen's eyes twitched. She tried to interrupt, but a board member held up his hand and told her to be quiet. Then came the twist. One of the board members, a man named James who had always remained neutral, stood up and cleared his throat. He said, "I received a message from the city's Environmental Compliance Office. They're investigating the clubhouse after receiving an anonymous report about illegal modifications made to the original drainage system. Specifically, the decision to cover 2 key runoff grates with landscaping to make the front entrance look cleaner." He looked directly at Karen. She froze. Everyone turned to her. And for the first time since I moved into that neighborhood, Karen didn't speak. Not a word. The silence was glorious. What followed next felt like the end of a courtroom drama. The board voted unanimously to drop all actions against me. The cease and desist was declared invalid. My system was deemed legal and even commendable. Then, in a move that shocked everyone, James motioned to open a formal ethics review into Karen's actions as HOA president. The crowd murmured. Someone clapped. It caught on quickly. Karen stormed out before the vote concluded. No dramatic closing statement. No threats. Just the sound of heels clacking angrily on tile. The Queen had left the building. That night, neighbors stopped by to congratulate me. Valerie brought homemade cookies. Theo dropped off a bottle of wine. One couple even asked if I'd help them set up their own water-saving system. Word spread fast. Karen had overplayed her hand, and now the whole board was shifting. Elections were coming up, and suddenly a lot of people were interested in change. Lucas texted me a meme of a crown made out of PVC pipe. I laughed so hard I nearly spilled my drink. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over just yet. Karen wasn't the type to give up easily. She might be wounded, humiliated, and under investigation, but she still lived 3 houses down, and she still had friends on the board. But now I had the neighborhood behind me. And I had the truth. And I had rain in the forecast. Which meant if she came back swinging, I'd be ready, with facts, with flow charts, and if necessary, with a new round of perfectly legal water management. Because the best revenge, it turned out, wasn't just sweet. It was soaked. The final storm didn't just wash away the last remnants of Karen's credibility, it rewrote the entire social dynamic of the neighborhood. It hit 2 weeks after the ethics hearing, a slow-building monster that dumped almost 7 inches of rain in under 24 hours. Power flickered across the subdivision, the creeks threatened to breach their banks, and multiple homes had minor flooding. But not mine. My yard, my garden, my foundation, bone dry. Even my newly planted hedges swayed gently in the storm's breeze, as if nodding in quiet approval of everything that had come before. Meanwhile, the clubhouse officially gave up. Water breached the newly patched drywall, the dehumidifiers short-circuited, and the sump pump, which had been struggling for weeks, finally gave out. It wasn't sabotage. It was inevitability. You can only ignore a problem for so long before nature forces you to deal with it head-on. That Monday, a follow-up city inspector visited the property. He didn't need long. By noon, a notice had been taped to the clubhouse door. Facility condemned pending environmental remediation. That was the final straw. Karen, who had been avoiding the public eye since the ethics vote, was seen standing in the parking lot, arms folded, jaw tight, refusing to speak to anyone. One neighbor offered her a towel out of sympathy. She didn't take it. She just walked away, got into her silver SUV, and drove off. That was the last time I saw her attend anything HOA related. Rumor had it she was planning to sell her house, blaming the toxic environment and anti-authority sentiment. I almost laughed when I heard that. Karen, calling others toxic, was like a skunk blaming the smell on the wind. The board moved quickly after her departure. Within a week, they appointed an interim president, James, the one who had blown the whistle at the emergency hearing. His first act was simple but powerful, suspending all HOA fines and citations until a full community review could be conducted. That move alone gained him instant respect. People finally felt like they were being heard instead of managed. The next announcement was even bigger. They opened the floor for new candidates to run in the upcoming election, including those who had never been part of the HOA before. And to my genuine surprise, multiple neighbors nominated me. At first, I laughed it off. I didn't want to be part of the same organization that had fined me for collecting rainwater. But then Theo and Valerie showed up at my door with a petition. Over 30 signatures. All people who felt like I had stood up for them by standing up to Karen. I sat on my porch that night and thought about it. I didn't want power. I didn't need a title. But maybe, just maybe, having someone who understood how things actually worked, someone who respected logic, sustainability, and personal rights, was exactly what the neighborhood needed. So I said yes. The election wasn't even close. James stayed on as president. I became the new environmental officer. Valerie joined the finance committee. Within a month, the entire board had shifted. Gone were the days of chasing down residents for having unapproved flower pots or using the wrong mulch color. We rewrote the bylaws with clarity, fairness, and a healthy dose of common sense. More importantly, we made it a rule that no policy could contradict city, state, or federal law. If the city encouraged sustainability, the HOA couldn't penalize it. That rule alone made a huge difference. One of our first major projects was rebuilding the clubhouse, not just fixing it, but reimagining it. We brought in contractors to assess the foundation, improved the entire drainage system using real civil planning, and installed rooftop rain catchers that filtered water into a community irrigation system. We even added educational signage about stormwater management, complete with a plaque that read, "In honor of all those who believe common sense shouldn't require permission." It was part joke, part mission statement. Karen never showed up to the unveiling, of course. By then, her house had a for sale sign out front. A few curious buyers came through, but they didn't stick around. One of them asked a neighbor about the clubhouse. The neighbor laughed and said, "Oh, that? You can thank Karen for the indoor swimming hole." Another buyer found the viral Reddit thread someone had started about the HOA saga. Screenshots of her emails, quotes from her cease and desist letter, and a video of her trying to argue that rain barrels violated aesthetic harmony had spread like wildfire. Internet fame wasn't the kind she had wanted. I ran into her one last time, purely by accident. She was at the gas station, sunglasses on, clearly trying to avoid eye contact. I nodded politely. She stared for a second, then looked away. Not a word. Not even a glare. Just silence. And in that silence I realized something. I didn't feel angry anymore. I didn't need her to apologize or admit she was wrong. She had already lost everything she built on pettiness and control. And I had gained something far better. A community that had learned how to stand together and laugh in the rain. That spring, I hosted a backyard barbecue. The theme was water conservation. People showed up with custom-decorated rain barrels, including one shaped like a dragon and another painted like a galaxy. Lucas gave a short talk on passive irrigation systems. A few kids splashed around in a slip-and-slide that we'd cleverly routed using runoff from the new downspout. Someone brought a cake shaped like a barrel, complete with chocolate drizzle water spilling from the top. We called it the Rain Barrel Bash. It became an annual tradition. By summer, the neighborhood had transformed. People who never used to talk now helped each other with garden projects. We launched a tool-sharing program. A retired contractor offered free porch repairs. The atmosphere had shifted from one of silent compliance to vibrant collaboration. And every time a new storm rolled in, I'd stand by the window, watching the water flow precisely where it should, knowing that everything, the drama, the sabotage, the hearings, even the awkward mailbox notes, had led to this moment. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It never really had been, not in the purest sense. It was about accountability, about proving that even the smallest acts, like installing a rain barrel, can ripple into something much bigger. That sometimes, when authority loses its way, the only thing that can bring balance is someone willing to plant their feet, check the slope, and redirect the flow. The rain came again that night. Gentle at first, then steady. My system whirred quietly in the background, valves clicking into place, water channeled efficiently into tanks, pipes, and gravel trenches. And as I stood there sipping tea, I thought of the clubhouse, now stronger than before, and the people who had once been strangers but now stood beside me in meetings, in gardens, and in storms. Let the rain fall. We were ready.